Norfolk, England, February 1945. The train slows near a line of frostbitten poplars. In the darkened carriage, boots scrape, chains rattle, breath clouds the air. Hans Keller presses his forehead to the plank wall, feeling the pulse of the engine through the wood. He's been awake 20 hours, though he's stopped counting. Through a slit in the boards he sees light, pale, low, unfamiliar. Not the glare of searchlights, not fire, just dawn spilling over fields that look impossibly calm. No barbed wire, no ruins, only the faint shimmer of frost. The whistle shrieks once, then silence. The door slides open. A British corporal in a heavy coat shouts something clipped, then gestures toward a waiting truck. Johann braces for the shove, the bark, the blow. None comes. Instead, the corporal's voice softens. Off you go, lads. Mind the step. Outside, the air stings with cold and coal smoke. A kettle hisses on a brazier beside the truck. Steam curls upward like breath from a sleeping beast. A private ladles tea into a dented pot and nods. Hot one, careful. Johann hesitates. The cup pressed into his hand is warm, its rim chipped, the metal thin as paper. The tea tastes of smoke and tin. It burns his tongue, and for a moment he isn't sure if he's been spared or mocked. The British government made a decision in the winter of 1939, one that would quietly shape the moral battlefield of the war. Before the first German soldier set foot on British soil as a prisoner, officials gathered in London and agreed Britain would uphold the Geneva Convention fully and visibly. Not out of sentimentality, but strategy. Humanity, they decided, could serve as a weapon more precise than any rifle. It was a calculation built on 4 principles. Security, prisoners treated with dignity caused fewer problems. A man who ate well, slept warm, and knew the rules was less likely to risk escape or mutiny. Intelligence. A comfortable prisoner was a talkative prisoner. Gratitude loosened tongues that pain could never unlock. Diplomacy. Every act of fairness shown in Britain could be leveraged abroad, where British POWs faced uncertain fates in German camps. And finally, morality. Britain claimed to fight for civilization itself. To betray that ideal through cruelty would hollow out the cause. By 1945, more than 400,000 Axis prisoners, mostly Germans and Italians, were scattered across Britain. They lived in camps stitched into the countryside, from the highlands of Scotland to the coasts of Devon. Some were housed in old army barracks, others in clusters of Nissen huts built in muddy fields beside farms and factories. Red Cross inspectors moved among them like quiet shadows, clipboard in hand, ensuring compliance down to the calorie. Records were filed, rations counted, conditions logged. Commandants who stepped out of line were swiftly replaced. The mortality rate among these prisoners remained remarkably low, less than 1% across the entire war. Most deaths were from wounds carried over from battle, not neglect or abuse. It was bureaucracy at its most humane, a system of restraint enforced not by compassion alone but by policy and paperwork. Hans Müller knew none of this. To him, the war had ended in a blur of surrender and disbelief. He'd been told his capture meant slavery, torture, or slow death. Instead, he found himself standing in a damp English barn, holding a mug of steaming tea poured by a British sergeant who looked almost bored by the whole affair. When Hans arrived at Camp 174 in Somerset, it barely looked like a prison. The wire fences were there, yes, but so were birds, hedgerows, and the faint smell of earth after rain. The intake officer spoke clipped German from a phrase book. Name, rank, number. Each word sounded careful, deliberate. Hans answered, his voice tight. His watch, a silver Omega, his father's, was placed into a brown envelope with his name written neatly on it. Returned after war, the officer said. Hans almost laughed. His assigned hut smelled faintly of sawdust and smoke. There was a straw mattress, a wool blanket, and a small iron stove that glowed faintly through the night. For the first time in months, he slept without expecting a siren or a shout. Meals were simple but filling, stew thick with mutton and root vegetables. 2 slices of bread, a dab of margarine, and tea served hot enough to burn the tongue. During the first meal, no one spoke. The clatter of spoons echoed like gunfire. Then, from the far end of the table, an older sergeant began to weep silently. No one mocked him. They all understood. Survival was not relief. It was confusion. The following week, Hans was assigned to a labor detail. Every morning at 6:30, he and a dozen others marched under light guard to a nearby dairy farm. Their overseer was Corporal Davies, a Welshman with a limp and an air of weary indifference. "You work fair, I treat fair," he said on the first day. "You slack, you sit in the hut all day. No extras, clear?" The work was steady, mending fences, mucking stalls, hauling milk churns. It was hard, honest labor, and strangely enough, it felt familiar. The rhythm of it filled the silence that war had hollowed out. The farmer, Mr. Hancock, was a man of few words and fewer smiles. His sons were gone, one fighting in Burma, the other buried in Normandy. He did not hate the Germans, only the war that had taken too much from everyone. One afternoon, when the men finished early, Hancock appeared with a jug of cider and tin cups. He poured without a word. The liquid was sharp, tart, alive with the taste of autumn. Hans drank and blinked in surprise. Hancock just nodded once and walked away. After that day, small changes crept into their routine. An extra slice of bread in the lunch pail. A pause in the rain for tea. A gesture here and there. Unspoken acknowledgments of shared exhaustion. None of it felt like forgiveness, just the quiet understanding that cruelty had run its course. By spring, Hans's English had improved enough to exchange short phrases. The local children, curious and unafraid, waved at the prisoners as they passed. Sometimes they threw apples over the fence. Hans would catch one, take a bite, and remember that the world beyond barbed wire still held sweetness. War had stripped him of belief. But England, damp, gray, and restrained, was teaching him something unexpected. That mercy, when given structure, could be stronger than vengeance. The village lies half a mile down the road from the camp, close enough for the prisoners to see the church steeple on clear mornings, but too far to ever walk to unaccompanied. On Sundays, though, the rules soften. Locals come by the farm to sell eggs, deliver laundry, or barter vegetables for labor. The first villager to speak to Hans directly is Mrs. Pritchard, a widow in her late 50s with hands like gnarled oak roots and eyes that have seen too much war to bother hating anyone anymore. She sets down a basket of socks near the barn, where Hans is oiling a leather harness. "You're the one from Bavaria, aren't you?" she asks, her voice neither hostile nor warm. Hans blinks, then nods. "Yes, ma'am. My husband's cousin lived in Munich once," she says, half to herself. "Lovely city. Before all this, that's all. No sermon, no judgment." The next week she returns for the mended socks and leaves behind a small jar of jam with no label. Hans spreads it on his bread that evening. The taste is sweet, unmistakably strawberry, but beneath it is something harder to name. Something like forgiveness, but not quite. By summer, trust grows in increments so small no one can pinpoint when it began. The guards stop pacing the fence line every hour. The prisoners are allowed to sit outside their huts after supper, breathing air that doesn't smell of iron or fear. Someone finds a football, no one asks where, and soon there are matches in the dusty yard. Prisoners against guards, shirts versus skins. The games are fierce but friendly, full of laughter that sounds strange at first, then natural. The British play with the same grim focus they bring to everything. Losing is not an option, even to prisoners. Then one afternoon, Mr. Hancock, the farmer, tosses Hans a set of keys. "You've driven one before?" he asks, nodding toward the old Fordson tractor. Hans hesitates, then answers, "Yes." "Good," Hancock says. "Northfield needs harrowing."
"I'll be in the house."
Don't make me regret this. For the first time, Hans works alone. No guards, no watchful eyes, just the steady thrum of the engine and the smell of tilled soil. He could keep driving, to the coast maybe, to freedom. But freedom has become abstract, distant. Instead, he harrows the field cleanly, row by row, parks the tractor beside the barn, and returns the keys. Hancock checks the fuel gauge, grunts approvingly, and says, "Good lad." Hans is 27 years old, a German soldier in enemy hands, and a British farmer has just called him good lad. He doesn't know whether to laugh or cry. In June, a wave of dysentery sweeps through Hut 9. The camp doctor, Captain Ellison, is a man built from equal parts competence and irritation. Too old for the front, too skilled to be retired, he treats the prisoners with the same brisk professionalism he gives his own countrymen. Rehydration salts, quarantine, bedding burned, replaced. No speeches, no pity. One patient, a young private from Hamburg, drifts into feverish delirium calling out for his mother in German. Ellison doesn't understand a word, but he sits beside the man's bunk anyway, checking his pulse, adjusting his blankets. "You'll be all right, son," he murmurs. "You'll be all right." The man survives. Everyone notices. It is an unspoken lesson. Mercy enforced by habit is stronger than cruelty justified by passion. Of the 400,000 Axis prisoners held in Britain, fewer than 1 in 200 die during their internment, roughly 0.3%. Most succumb to wounds sustained before capture, or illnesses contracted long before they reached English soil. The British Medical Corps treats them not as enemies but as patients. There is no propaganda in it, no moral grandstanding. It is policy. Civilization turned procedural. One evening, Hans watches Ellison leave the hut, his black medical bag swinging at his side, and realizes something unsettling. If they wanted us dead, he thinks, we would be dead. They don't want us dead. They want us managed. They want us redeemed, or at least contained. By Christmas 1945, the war in Europe has been over for months, but repatriation crawls at the pace of paperwork. Hans and 200 other Germans still occupy Camp 174, waiting for ships, for trains, for permission to return to a homeland that exists only in fragments. The camp chaplain, Father Hennessy, an Irish Catholic with a soft face and an iron sense of calm, announces a joint service for Christmas Eve. Attendance is voluntary. Hans goes anyway. The hymn is Silent Night, first in English, then in German. The sound that fills the mess hall is hesitant at first, then stronger, trembling but sincere. The guards stand at the back with caps in hand. Some even mouth the German words, getting them wrong but trying anyway. When it ends, Hennessy doesn't preach. He simply opens a tin of shortbread, passes it around, and says, "Merry Christmas, lads." Hans steps outside into the snow. The air tastes sharp like cold metal and wood smoke. A guard, Bennett, the young one from Devon, lights a cigarette beside him. "Funny old war, innit?" he says. Hans exhales a long ribbon of smoke. "Funny old war," he replies. They stand together in silence, watching the snow bury the footprints between the huts, a quiet white truce that no treaty could ever put into words. In January 1946, Hans writes a letter to his mother. He doesn't know if it will ever reach her. The Red Cross still processes thousands of letters each week, but half vanish into the ruins of a country without roads, without order. Still, he writes, "Dear Mother, I am alive. I am well. The British treat us fairly. The food is plain, but we work, and the air is clean. You would like the hills here? They look a little like the ones above Garmisch. Only softer." He signs it, "Your son Hans," and hands it to the camp clerk, who adds it to a pile marked outgoing mail. He watches the clerk stamp each envelope, wondering if kindness can survive the distance between broken nations. By spring, rumors ripple through the barracks. Some prisoners may be allowed to stay, to work in Britain instead of returning home to hunger and rubble. Many dismiss it as false hope. But then a notice appears in the mess hall signed by Captain Ellison himself. Voluntary labor scheme. Agricultural placements available. Fair wages. Repatriation upon completion, Hans applies. Hancock, the farmer, writes a reference in his square, careful hand. Good worker. Reliable, no trouble. It is the first written praise Hans has received since before the war. When his new assignment comes, it is not to Germany, but 30 miles north. Another farm, another county. This one has no fences, no guards, no roll calls, only work. The farmer, Mr. Wilcox, treats Hans like any other hired hand. Mrs. Wilcox brings tea at 10 and supper at 6, setting it down without comment. Their daughter, Margaret, 15, watches Hans with cautious curiosity. One evening she asks, "Do you really have castles where people live inside them?" Hans smiles. "Some," he says. "Mostly just ruins now." He learns the rhythm of their life. Mornings start with the milking, then fence repair, plowing, sowing. The work is heavy, but the silence is lighter than before. He reads English from old newspapers left on the kitchen table. The Daily Mail, the Times. From them he learns that Churchill has lost the election, that Nuremberg is underway, that Germany is no longer one country but 4, each ruled by a different army. The world, it seems, has moved on while he was behind wire. In August, a miracle arrives. A thin envelope, edges rubbed soft from travel. The handwriting is shaky but unmistakable. His mother's, "My dear son, we are alive. Your sister works in a bakery. The house is gone, but we live with friends near Ulm. God bless the English for feeding us. Come home when you can." Hans reads it 3 times, his throat tightening with something too big for words. He folds the letter carefully, smooths the creases with his thumb, and keeps it in his jacket pocket until the paper begins to fray. That winter, the frost comes early. He helps Mr. Wilcox dig a drainage ditch near the orchard. The ground is frozen hard, their shovels clinking against stone. After an hour, Wilcox straightens, breath smoking, and says, "You know, Hans, you're free to go now. No one would stop you." Hans nods slowly. "I know, sir." Wilcox leans on his spade. "And yet here you are." Hans looks at the frozen earth, then back at the farmer. "Yes, sir. Here I am." He doesn't say what he's thinking, that he no longer knows where home is, that he feels less like a prisoner here than he ever did as a soldier. By 1947, thousands of former POWs are scattered across Britain, working on farms and factories and sawmills and quarries. Some marry, some go home, others simply vanish into the quiet machinery of post-war life. The government keeps its promise to dismantle the camps. The huts are torn down or converted into housing for British families. By 1948, Camp 174, once Hans's world, is gone, erased by grass and memory. Hans stays until 1949. When the letter finally arrives confirming his repatriation, he feels both relief and loss. On the morning of his departure, Mr. and Mrs. Wilcox walk him to the station. Margaret, now 18, carries a folded note in her gloved hand. She waits until the whistle sounds, then presses it into his palm. "Thank you for teaching me to say Guten Morgen." He tucks it into his coat pocket beside his mother's letter. The train rattles south toward Southampton. Beyond the window, England rolls past in soft greens and grays, fields, cottages, fog. At the harbor, the sea air smells of salt and coal smoke. The ship sails at dusk. Hans stands at the rail as the coastline fades into mist. He thinks of the farm, of Hancock's rough nods, of Ellison's quiet professionalism, of Father Hennessy's shortbread and cigarettes, of football games that blurred the line between enemies and men. He thinks of the first mug of bitter tea, scalding and real, handed to him in a barn surrounded by strangers, and somewhere between sea and sky, he realizes that everything since has been a slow unfolding of that same bewildering kindness, not soft, not sentimental, but steady and undeniable. He is going home, though he no longer knows what that means. His country is divided, its cities shattered, its people rebuilding from ashes, but part of him will always remain in that damp Somerset barn, where the first thing his captors ever gave him was warmth, and where he began, unknowingly, to believe in the possibility of peace. Hans would later say that captivity taught him 2 kinds of silence, the one forced on you and the one you choose. The first is survival. The second, peace. When the war ended, he expected punishment, maybe hatred. What he found instead was structure, decency, and something stranger than either: forgiveness without words. He was not grateful to be captured. He was ashamed to have survived when so many did not. Yet the British never asked him to atone, never reminded him of guilt or loss. They handed him tools, not pity, work, not penance. And through that quiet consistency, they built something more enduring than victory. They built the possibility of trust. In the years that followed, repatriation trains rumbled east, their carriages full of men carrying fragments of their former lives, dog tags, ration cards, folded letters that smelled of mildew and hope. Some prisoners went eagerly, desperate to find family. Others lingered, uncertain whether home still existed in the same shape they remembered. A few stayed by choice. Britain, rebuilding itself from its own exhaustion, needed hands to plow, to build, to mend. The government called it temporary labor, but to men like Hans it felt like a strange continuation of mercy. He worked for wages now, not rations. He sent money home to his mother. He planted wheat in fields where bombs had once fallen. He learned English by reading the Daily Mail aloud in the evenings, repeating headlines until the vowels came naturally. When villagers passed him on the lane, some nodded, some crossed the road, but most said nothing, and that nothing was its own kind of acceptance. He stayed long enough to feel the seasons repeat. In spring, the lambs bleated under low clouds. In summer, the hedgerows bloomed purple and gold. He learned to measure time not by the war that ended, but by the crops that grew. He began to smile again, carefully, as if remembering how In 1948, when his permit expired, Hans faced a choice. Germany, still divided and hungry, waited for its sons to return. Britain, battered but stable, offered work and quiet routine. He could have remained. Some of his friends did, but something in him needed closure. Not triumph, just completion. Hans would later say that captivity taught him two kinds of silence, the one forced on you and the one you choose. The first is survival. The second, peace. When the war ended, he expected punishment, maybe hatred. What he found instead was structure, decency, and something stranger than either. Forgiveness without words. He was not grateful to be captured. He was ashamed. Ashamed to have survived when so many did not. Yet the British never asked him to atone, never reminded him of guilt or loss. They handed him tools, not pity, work, not penance. And through that quiet consistency, they built something more enduring than victory. They built the possibility of trust. In the years that followed, repatriation trains rumbled east, their carriages full of men carrying fragments of their former lives, dog tags, ration cards, folded letters that smelled of mildew and hope. Some prisoners went eagerly, desperate to find family. Others lingered, uncertain whether home still existed in the same shape they remembered. A few stayed by choice. Britain, rebuilding itself from its own exhaustion, needed hands to plow, to build, to mend. The government called it temporary labor, but to men like Hans it felt like a strange continuation of mercy. He worked for wages now, not rations. He sent money home to his mother. He planted wheat in fields where bombs had once fallen. He learned English by reading the Daily Mail aloud in the evenings, repeating headlines until the vowels came naturally. When villagers passed him on the lane, some nodded, some crossed the road, but most said nothing, and that nothing was its own kind of acceptance. He stayed long enough to feel the seasons repeat. In spring, the lambs bleated under low clouds. In summer, the hedgerows bloomed purple and gold. He learned to measure time not by the war that ended, but by the crops that grew. He began to smile again, carefully, as if remembering how. In 1948, when his permit expired, Hans faced a choice. Germany, still divided and hungry, waited for its sons to return. Britain, battered but stable, offered work and quiet routine. He could have remained. Some of his friends did, but something in him needed closure. Not triumph, just completion.